Thank you all for coming to this presentation on what happens next for disability justice. I'm going to go through a little PowerPoint with you, and then I'll take this off the screen. So as I said, my name is Andrew Romanoff. I'm the Executive Director of Disability Law Colorado. We're pleased to have a group of distinguished panelists I'll introduce in a moment. And I wanted to tell you a little bit about our organization, DLC. This organization has been around since 1976. We were designated the following year by Governor Lamb as Colorado's protection and advocacy system. There are 57 such agencies across the country, one for every state and territory. Our job, as authorized by federal law, is to investigate and prevent discrimination, abuse, and neglect on behalf of people with physical, intellectual, developmental disabilities, people with traumatic brain injuries, and people with disabling mental health and substance use disorders. So we have a team of about 24 attorneys, advocates, investigators, and other staff who are committed to that work and pursuing it every day. But our goal is not just to attack the mistreatment of people with disabilities. It's really to make Colorado the #1 state in America for people with disabilities to work and thrive. And that's part of the topic we're here today to address. If you want to learn more about Disability Law Colorado or chip in to our effort, you can go to our website at disabilitylawco.org. That's disabilitylawco.org. When I took this job a year ago, the board said, unless I really screwed up, I could count on a steady stream of federal revenue to support our efforts. The federal funds make up about 95% of our budget. So if you want to help keep us going, whatever the federal winds may blow, I hope you go to disabilitylawco.org and lend your support. We have a group of partners who are making today's event possible. They include as supporting partners the Colorado Health Foundation, Craig Hospital, and the Colorado Developmental Disabilities Council, along with our community partners, the ARC of Colorado, the Colorado Cross Disability Coalition, represented by one of their executive directors I'll introduce in a moment, and the Colorado Center on Law and Policy, which also has a leader here on our panel today. Those panelists are, in alphabetical order, Eric Buehlmann, who is the Deputy Executive Director of Public Policy at the National Disability Rights Network. My friend and former colleague, Bob Gardner, who served in the Colorado State House and Colorado State Senate. The Honorable Kathy Gebhardt, Bob's honorable too. I just want to make sure Kathy gets her due as newly elected member of the Colorado Board of Education from the 2nd Congressional District. Hillary Jorgensen, who is co-executive director of the Colorado Cross Disability Coalition, one of our partners today and every day. And Bethany Prey, who is chief legal and policy officer for the Colorado Center on Law and Policy. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now so that you can see these distinguished panelists in all their distinction. And remind again the audience, if you have questions, as some of you have already figured out, you can put them not in the chat, but instead in the Q&A feature, which we will be monitoring as we go through this event. And we'll turn to your questions after a few of my own that I'd like to pose to the panel now. And we'll start, I suppose, in the same order I introduced folks. Eric Buehlmann, you are coming to us from our mothership in Washington. National Disability Rights Network is the trade association for all 57 protection and advocacy agencies across the country, like Disability Law Colorado. You've been there, as I understand it, at NDRN for 20 years or so. Is that right? Almost 20 years.
Almost 20. I'll be 20 next year.
So I have two questions for you. One, what do you get upon your 20th anniversary at NDRN? And second, what, if anything, has surprised you about the last month in Washington? And I'll ask you just to speak slowly so we can keep up with the interpreters, or vice versa.
So for 20 years at NDRN, I think we get thanks and love from all 57 members. I will expect that next year. Um, in terms of what surprised me, I'm going to say the speed, the ferocity, and sort of the yeah, it's really just sort of the speed and ferocity that they've come out of the gates. I'm not sure I should have been surprised by that, given that they had one term to sort of perfect it. But I think it's been a little surprising how quickly they have thrown out as much stuff as they've done. I guess the second surprise I would say is the unwillingness of Congress to stand up for what I think is their constitutional duties. Um, so I think that's sort of been the two big surprises for me so far.
Thanks for sharing that. Senator Gardner, I imagine you are not easily surprised. You served in the Air Force, for which we thank you. You served as the chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee. You're now experiencing life after the legislature. There is such a thing, I'm told. So tell me, have you encountered any surprises in the last 4 weeks observing the goings on in Washington?
Well, I like Eric, but perhaps um, even more strongly, the thing that's been surprising to me is how astounding uh, um, things have been over the past month. Shocking, even. Um, the I will speak. You graciously didn't mention my party, but I'm a member of the Republican Party. Um, but I've been shocked at the number of things that have been traditional Republican issues that have been sort of gone by the wayside and disavowed in the past month. Almost a complete realignment of um, the era of Reagan to the era of Trump, and I won't go too far down that road, but that's been most shocking to me.
I didn't mean to omit your party affiliation. You're not just a Republican, you're a Colorado Springs Republican. Uh, so you have some standing in this debate. Kathy
Well, yeah,
Gebhardt, you are not a Republican, but you are well qualified for the job you now hold on the State Board of Education, having led both the Boulder Valley School Board and the Colorado Association of School Boards, among other accomplishments in your fight for educational funding equity in Colorado. Tell us, please, if you have been surprised. Are you capable of surprise at this point?
Sadly, I think I share my colleagues on this webinar's disappointment and discouragement at the kind of shock and awe approach that they're doing. And I think what surprises me and discourages me the most is the total disregard for the impact of their decisions on families and everyday people in the country. There seems to be no recognition at all of taking sledgehammers to people's lives and just going forward. So I think that's what's surprising me. We can talk later about, doing away with the Department of Education and those kind of more specific issues. But I think to me, I think we've all seen the stories of what these impacts are having on everyday Americans. And I think that's really discouraging to me.
Hillary Jorgensen, your job now is to lift us from discouragement into inspiration. I appreciate your leadership on this front and your partnership in the fight for disability justice. Can you tell us a little bit about Colorado Cross Disability Coalition? And you're welcome to answer the question about surprises too, please.
Yes, thank you, Andrew. So the Colorado Cross Disability Coalition is a statewide advocacy organization run for people with disabilities by people with disabilities. Our motto is actually nothing about us without us. And, we operate on a grassroots model. So we are a membership organization. We have 5,000 members across the state. And, you know, I have been surprised by the fact that even though this administration has had time to plan some of their actions, just how messy a lot of their executive orders and the Department of Developmental Efficiency has been, and maybe that's the point. But I have also been really heartened by how our members and people with disabilities in general have stepped up. And we can talk more about that later, but I think there is hope, even though things are very bad right now.
Bethany, pray keep hope alive, and tell us, please, both what you have been surprised by, if anything, and tell us, if you don't mind, please, something about the Colorado Center on Policy for folks who might not be familiar with your organization.
Sure. Colorado Center on Law and Policy is also a statewide anti-poverty organization, and we work in several areas, food, health, income, housing. But one of my main focuses has really been Medicaid during my 10 years at CCLP. We do advocate for the needs of all Coloradans. And I think what we're seeing here and the shock everyone is talking about is a threat to really all Americans, all Coloradans. But more pointed impacts on people with disabilities and on racial groups, immigrants. The surprise, though, I know, adding to everybody else's dismay, I think what continues to surprise me, is that people don't know a lot about Medicaid. They don't know how fundamental it is for the whole health coverage system, and how fundamental it is in keeping people participating in work and in community, especially people with disabilities. And I think, if there's a bright point here, it's that this is a really important education moment for us to make sure that policymakers understand that we cannot function as a state without Medicaid dollars and without the support for people with disabilities that we've been providing. So I think that's my current takeaway. And we really look to CCDC and others for doing an amazing job of also showing us how you can organize, how you can get people together, how you can be unified in your approach to advocacy.
I appreciate that. I share your sentiments about our friends at CCDC. I'll just stick with you for a moment, Bethany, because you spoke of threats to Medicaid in particular. So can you tell us, and I'll go back through the list here, but with respect to Medicaid, what is the worst case scenario, especially for people with disabilities? What's the threat both in Colorado and in other states?
Well, people are still putting together those numbers, and there's a lot of work on the part of clinics and hospitals and the state to figure out what the cost of different proposals would be. But I'm going to talk for a minute about work requirements, because I think that's an area where people think that people with disabilities are not implicated. That's not the case. Many people who have disabilities access Medicaid through other programs, not necessarily. We have about 90,000+ people in Colorado who are in Medicaid eligibility categories that relate to disability. But there are many people in the regular income categories, adults or parent caretakers, who also have disabilities. And work requirements would work sort of badly in two ways. One is to exempt people who are unable to work. People with disabilities are not unable to work. Many people do meaningful work in their communities, contribute to their household income. That's part of being integrated into the community. So on the other hand, they don't have necessarily full-time work. They don't have access to that. So work requirements would have pretty devastating effects. It's not the stereotype we've heard about the quote able-bodied person who's choosing not to work. You know, people on Medicaid for the most part do work, or they're taking care of somebody else.
Can you pick up where Bethany left off, Hillary, and talk about any threats that you see, either with respect to healthcare or other threats to disability justice that we might be on guard for?
Yes, I think Bethany, did a really good job of identifying some of the threats in Medicaid. Just to expand on that a little bit, so for a lot of people with disabilities, Medicaid is the only program in the entire country that covers long-term care. So if you need home health care in order to live independently, you have two choices, basically. You can be on Medicaid or you can win the lottery. And not very many of us will win the lottery in our lifetimes. So I think it's really, really important for decision makers and people in the general public to recognize that Medicaid is the only source of long-term care in the United States, not just Colorado, in the entire United States. So a threat to Medicaid funding is a threat to people's rights and ability to live in the communities of their choice and to be integrated, independent members of society. The disability community fought for a long time to get out of institutions and become a part of the community, and threats to Medicaid are a threat to that independence. I think I'm only supposed to take 2 minutes per question. Just really quickly, some other thoughts. Obviously, there were a bunch of really amazing rules around accessibility promulgated during the Biden administration. So the transportation around the accessibility of airlines, for instance, rules around the accessibility of the internet, basically, online life and apps and things like that. And I think we have a lot of concern about, those being at risk.
Thanks for sharing that. Kathy, you mentioned earlier the possibility of the Department of Education being dismantled at the federal level. What would that do, particularly to special education funding, where Colorado is already short? Or what other threats do you see when it comes to education and disability justice?
So one of the places I'm focused on as a concern is the Office of Civil Rights is housed in the Department of Education and does really amazing work in making sure that disability rights are enforced. And I see that coming to a screeching halt, and that makes me really concerned. The other question that you asked, Andrew, was about funding. We do get funding. The Department of Education funds IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, and we get that through the Department of Education. And what I'm hearing is that we may be getting that block granted, but not in the same amount of money that we've been getting. And we're already grossly underfunded for special education in Colorado. And we have a requirement called maintenance of effort. So somehow the state, which is facing an over $1 billion deficit right now, will have to figure out how to pay that. And they should. But so I see those as two of the biggest threats right now is the going away of the Office of Civil Rights and the threat to the amount and how the funding's going to come for IDEA.
Can you just spend it? I know you spelled out IDEA, but could you, the Individual with Disability Education Act, but can you spend another minute just telling us what not funding, fully funding that requirement would do? And whether Colorado would face litigation if it fails to comply?
well, I would hope they would face litigation if they fail to comply, but not funding it would put at serious risk the kinds of opportunities that we give to our students with disabilities and give them, and it would do away with some of the rights, I think. That's what I fear as well. So for example, having a para, if you have a significantly handicapped child, doing away with the kinds of medical services, lots of supports come to our children through IDEA. And if we didn't have that funding, I don't see them. We've heard about being able to be part of society and being integrated into a classroom. I see some of that going away because if we don't have the supports for those children to be in schools with the supports that they need, I worry about what that looks like.
I'm just going to stick with this topic for 1 minute longer. One of the participants is asking, with Division of Vocational Rehabilitation under the Department of Education, will this be affected, considering 80% of the funding comes from federal grants? Do you or other panelists want to just address that question? Or we can come back to it.
The answer is probably yes.
Yeah.
The theory they have is maybe transferring that to the Department of Labor because it's an employment related issue. But I think you lose the expertise, and that's what concerns me about, as Kathy was talking about, if you move the Office of Civil Rights or you move like the Office of Special Education over to another agency like the Administration on Community Living, they don't have the expertise. They haven't dealt with this for decades, for years, and they're not going to move all the people over. So it's that loss of knowledge and that loss of history and ability that I think is really the big part. So yeah, no, I mean, I think there's a big problem with moving any of this and just getting rid of all that expertise.
Senator Gardner, Bob, Kathy mentioned the Office of Civil Rights in the Department of Education. There's obviously also a civil rights enforcement as part of the Department of Justice, which the last time I checked was freezing its consideration of any new cases. So can you talk a little bit, please, about what happens if the Department of Justice no longer takes civil rights cases, or other impacts, particularly to people with disabilities, that we might expect at a federal judicial level?
Well, I think what we will have to rely on is more and more private causes of action. Organizations like Disability Law Colorado are going to have a tremendous burden, and at the same time, maybe a tremendous opportunity to sort of pick up the gauntlet on these things with a private causes of action. You know, you didn't ask this question, but of course, being a politician, I'm going to answer the one I wanted to answer.
You're well trained.
One of the things that was most shocking to me, I actually by profession am a federal procurement government contracting attorney, and for 50, 60 years, it has been a mantra that the Lyndon Johnson Executive Order 11246 was what really required affirmative action in this country, other than a few court orders here and there. And most people didn't understand that. It didn't matter. But if you did any kind of business with the federal government over maybe $50,000, which is practically every corporation in America, then you had to have an affirmative action program. You had to emphasize employment of people with disabilities, for instance. In one stroke of the pen, because that was an executive order, President Trump removed that in the first week, I think, in a really sort of an attack on DEI. But the way to do so was to just strike out what is accepted over a half century program that every corporate contractor, every corporation in America was doing. So that is going to mean, ironically, more federal lawsuits. I'm not sure the courts are ready to handle all of those. And then You have the question of a lot of backlog for funding issues. One of the things we haven't really talked about that affects everyone here is the Impoundment and Control Act. Can the executive branch really withhold all of those funds? And those suits are coming as well. I'll stop there.
That's a lot to take in. And Eric, I'm going to ask you to clean up on this round. Bob mentioned both affirmative action and diversity, equity, inclusion. We would add accessibility, which is also the first question we got from the audience here. What is the impact of this attack on DEI or DEI initiatives, particularly on people with disabilities? That's the first question I'll ask you. And then, do you have any latest read of the tea leaves when it comes to the imminent litigation around the Impoundment Act, which seems like a pretty clear effort on the part of the administration to exert more executive authority?
Okay, I'm going to follow the example of Senator Gardner and
answer the question you prefer.
Well, no, I'll answer your questions too. But the points made by Kathy, Hillary, and Bethany are very important because most members don't understand what Medicaid pays for. And they pay for a lot of education funding along with IDEA for students with disabilities. So cutting Medicaid in addition to cutting IDEA is just doubly devastating. Then, as both Hillary and Bethany said, most policymakers don't know what Medicaid does. They have this belief in their head, and you need to go in and you need to tell them that story about how important Medicaid is to you and what it allows you to do. So that's an extremely important. So circling back to the question you asked, Andrew, it is what's really difficult is the administration has not been consistent. They at times talk about disability, they talk about diversity, equity, inclusion, and sometimes accessibility, and they've sort of merged everything together, which at times has been confusing and an issue. But the disability community is fully inclusive. It doesn't care your sexual orientation. It doesn't care your race. It doesn't care your gender. Disability hits everybody. So any impact, even if it's just on the diversity, equity, inclusion part, and they phrase it as racial and gender, impacts people with disabilities. So there's a lot of real confusion. And when they go in and they're cutting the DEI staff, they're also taking out a lot of the accommodations staff, the people that provide accommodations to federal employees or to visitors or things like that to federal offices. So it's really impacting people with disabilities in a really bad way. On the impoundment lawsuit side, I unfortunately have a wife that is a budget nerd and loves this stuff. And so my belief should be that they would support that the executive branch just can't do these kinds of things and impound the funds. But I don't trust Congress to defend their rights under the Constitution to be the holder of the purse strings. And I don't honestly trust the way some of the courts are going right now in terms of their belief on like unitary executive theory and things like that. So it'll come. They'll push the envelope and want to impound funds, and then someone's going to have to sue, and we'll have to see how it plays out.
We'll clean up the transcript afterwards and remove the reference to your wife's hobby as unfortunate, just for the sake of your. I don't know what anniversary you're hoping to celebrate, but that doesn't help. I want to start with this last question of mine, and then I'll turn to the audience questions. And again, if you're in the audience and you have a question, please use the Q&A feature. 24 of you have already done so. I will try to do justice to those questions. I will say, if we run out the clock, which is likely because we're halfway through this panel, you're welcome to email us, and we'll try to use a courier to send those questions to other folks on the panel. A number of the questions we're getting from the audience, by the way, have to do with personal cases. We handle those. We try to address them. And so you're welcome to use our website, disabilitylawco.org, disabilitylawco.org, to ask a question about personal injustice. This panel is mostly focused on policy issues and ought to be focused not just on threats, but on opportunities or action. So I'll start with Hillary, perhaps. You and I talked about this a lot offline. What can people do if they want to advance the cause of disability justice and not surrender?
Yes. So, first, I know things are really overwhelming right now. Like, watching the news or reading the news makes me feel like I need a 2-week vacation every single day. It is demoralizing. It is terrifying. And that is part of a strategy, right? They are hoping to overwhelm us so much that we will not act. I have moved on from my community organizing days, but I am first and always a community organizer. And the thing I know about making change is that everyone doing the thing they can to stand up to the system or sit down to the system does make a difference. I know that calling your member of Congress feels like screaming into the void, but you know what? It has an impact. We know it has an impact for multiple reasons. First, when the budget freeze was announced a few weeks ago and Medicaid payments were also frozen, there was a national outpouring to congressional offices, and I believe that the reason the administration backed off some of those freezes is because there was such an outpouring. We're kind of seeing the same thing on Medicaid too. CCEC has been organizing against Medicaid cuts. People all across the nation have been organizing. Just this morning, the Republican Hispanic Caucus released a letter to Speaker Johnson. He is the person in control of the United States House, asking him not to cut Medicaid. Like, that is movement. And I know people want immediate end to all of this. Unfortunately, Pointless probably is not going to be super fast. But all of those little things that are happening, like the Congressional Hispanic Republican Caucus standing up against Medicaid cuts, right? Saying no Medicaid cuts. Like, that is pointless. And I am a big believer in everyone has unique talents and gifts, and whatever yours are, use them. If all you can do is make a phone call to your members of Congress once a week or once a day, do that. If all you can do is email people, like your members of Congress, do that. If you can show up to a rally, do that. If you can do district visits or even districts in visits to Washington, D.C. to meet your members of Congress, do that. And we are probably going to have a sustained level of action for a long time. You're not gonna just make one phone call and have it go away. You're gonna have to be in this fight together for a while. But I believe that if we come together and we fight, we can win because community organizing works. And people speaking out in numbers works. We almost had the ACA repealed and cuts to Medicaid in 2017, and people with disabilities led the fight to stop that, and we stopped it. So I know things feel awful, and it's like a dumpster fire every day, but you can't let that demoralize you into not taking action. Whatever kind of action you can do it. If you have a personal story about how Medicaid or Section 8 the planet has improved your life, share it and share it often. I'm going to stop talking because I'm taking up a lot of time.
No,
And I'm passionate about this.
your passion is well placed, and you're right. I think the more calls that people get from their constituents, especially when you start your letter by saying, "I live in your district and I vote," it kind of gets your attention as a politician. I want to turn to Bethany next to ask if there's action that you foresee at the state level that people could take. But I will mention we've got now 36 questions from, so I'm going to stop encouraging them, from the audience in the Q&A. And if you registered for this event by giving us your email address, we will try to circulate answers to that listserv we'll create, including a letter that Hillary mentioned and Eric just provided to us. We'll provide a link to that by email. I'll try to actually sneak it into the Q&A, the letter to Speaker Johnson. Bethany, in addition to writing to your members of Congress, what else can people do if they want to advance the cause of disability justice in Colorado or across the country? We actually have one participant in this audience, by the way, who's calling in from the UK. So if you have any advice for the Brits, you're welcome to add that to your answer too.
Well, we can talk about the National Health Service another time. I won't go into that. I also did see a question from someone who was worrying that the disability community would be the first to be sacrificed. And I just want to say that our organization and really all of the organizations we're working with is on board for not sacrificing any specific population, that what we need is to keep the whole system strong. I think on the state side of things, there's also a lot of education to do about why it's going to be so hard for Colorado to respond to federal cuts. And that is TABOR, the Taxpayer Bill of Rights. I'm not sure what Senator Gardner's view of this will be, but I mean, we really feel like we're in a position where our budget is block granted. It's a small, inflexible budget. When Kathy talked about the maintenance of effort for IDEA, we don't have a way to increase our budget so that we can cover those costs. If we're talking about losing federal funding for in terms of our federal match that we get for Medicaid, we don't have a way to backfill on that. So I think it's important for people in Colorado to also be speaking to their representatives about the importance of finding a way to create flexibility in our budget. How do we make sure that if we have an economic shock, if we have major federal losses, how are we going to respond to that as a state? I would encourage people to learn more about that and to think more about how we can build that flexibility for the future.
Bob, since Bethany invoked your name, the usual rules of debate give you a chance to respond. Before you do that, I want to say, with respect to the letter to Speaker Johnson, I put that in the Q&A answers. So folks in the audience, if you go to the section of the Q&A that includes answered questions, you'll see the last one, a question from Sabrina, gets answered with a link, thanks to Eric. Bob, let me ask Bethany's question in a different way, I guess. Does the prospect or likelihood of federal budget cuts change, do you suppose, Colorado's conversation about TABOR, either within the legislature or at the ballot among voters?
Well, I think what voters think of when you talk about TABOR is their right to vote on tax increases, and they get a TABOR refund check from Democratic governors who sign their names at the bottom of that check to make sure that they know they got it back from his administration. So it is an interesting dynamic. But I think it will cause a discussion about whether the people of Colorado would be willing to support something along the lines of referendum C if we had overages. I think the problem is, or will be, not having to give back money in a future year. The problem is going to be not having an economy that supports what the states need to do. With or without Tabor, if you look around the country, states picking up the slack of a decreased federal budget is going to be problematic, to say the least. You're going to get some states that are just unwilling to do it, even though they have the money. You're going to have Colorado that, if they do in fact have the money, are going to have to ask the voters, what do you want us to do about this? So I think you almost have an upheaval in how things are funded. I think everybody, for the most part, in this conversation knows that our general fund portion of Colorado's budget has become less than the federal funding that's given to us. I say given, sent back to us every year, and it changes the entire expectations of citizens about where that money's coming from. We have had very conservative Republicans who have refused federal funding in places like El Paso County, Douglas County. I think we're going to see that money just not coming, and them having to figure out what to do.
There's a live response coming now from a Jared P. Caller, you're on the line if you want. No, I'm just teasing.
I'd be happy to take that one.
I'll give him your cell. Just to subtitle some of Bob's answer, for those folks who maybe moved to Colorado since 1992, Tabor, the Taxpayer Bill of Rights, both gives voters the right to say yes or no on changes in tax policy that bring in more revenue, whether you're a city, a county, a state, a school district, a special district, or any other governmental entity, and caps the amount that the state can keep from year to year. Referendum C was the last time, to my knowledge, the voters approved a change in the formula by both giving the state a 5-year timeout from Tabor's revenue limits and changing the ratchet effect in Tabor that was trapping the state at a recessionary level of services, pegging, in other words, the limit at whatever the revenues came in the year before. So that'll be a conversation that may end up on the ballot at some point, as Bob said. I do want to do justice both to Kathy and to Eric and to all of the now 46 questions that have come in online. So Kathy, a couple questions on higher education. I don't know if you're comfortable weighing in on that. Is there any impact that we should anticipate to higher ed? I know the board on which you sit does not control that level of education in Colorado. So feel free to take a swing or give us any other opportunities. And what can we do? What can people do at what can school districts do, if anything?
So I think I'll answer your second question first, because I'm not a higher ed person, but I am very concerned about the lack of money coming into our higher ed institutions for things like scientific research. And I know from my conversations with regents and others connected with that, they are very concerned about that as well, in a much more direct way than the impact funding or lack of funding will have on K-12. I just think it's a much more dramatic potential impact on the higher ed institutions. What I have been encouraged about, I'm trying to find something bright to say in this, is I have seen school districts and school boards come together in ways to try to figure out how to protect our immigrant communities, making sure that families have temporary custodial papers in place, making sure that people know what their rights are. I've seen a very encouraging movement on the whole Know Your Rights movement, and families stepping up to try to help everybody. And so I think that kind of community gathering gives me some hope. And it's along the same lines as what Hillary was saying, is that we're in this for the long haul. This isn't just going to be a short stint, unfortunately. And even if they are successful in dismantling so many of our programs, we need to stay together so that we can help rebuild them when the opportunity comes. So I am very encouraged by just the communities coming together around all of their students. That gives me some hope. The other thing I would say, it's a little wonky, is that we have an attorney general who I think will step up and take on some of these issues. And I think we need to make sure that we have as many state right protections as we can that are not dependent on the federal. So we have seen Attorney General Phil Reiser already engage in some of these litigations. And I think we need to reach out to his office and say, where can you step in when OCR cannot? And what can we do to make sure that our laws are protecting all of our citizens in ways that won't be dependent and won't fall apart when the government steps in, the US government. So those are my two.
I appreciate that. It's worth pointing out to your last note that the House Health and Human Services Committee just passed by a unanimous vote a measure, House Bill 1017, that would enshrine in state law the protections the Supreme Court interpreted in a case called Olmstead. So that proposal now goes to the House Appropriations Committee, and it's one that I know CCDC and Disability Law Colorado and other groups strongly support and has enjoyed bipartisan support in the state legislature. Eric, I'm going to use you, if you don't mind, to answer a couple of the questions, and others should feel free to weigh in as well, that are coming in on from the audience here. Will Medicaid cuts affect Section 8 housing? Bethany may have a thought on that as well.
You're getting a little beyond my expertise, but I do think there is a part of Medicaid funding that helps with housing. So I would have to say that I don't think it's directly to Section 8, but I do think there are Medicaid funds that help with the housing of people with disabilities. So I do think there would be a connection there.
Bethany, do you have a thought on that?
I don't. I would need to look at more recent guidance, but I think just in the area of reasonable accommodations and making sure that those are offered, that's always a little bit of a struggle, whether it's with Section 8 or other housing programs. So we'll need to look closely at that and do what we can to support and continuing accommodations.
Kathy, one of the participants is asking you to repeat the maintenance of effort requirement. I think that you were describing when you were talking earlier about IDEA and special ed funding.
It's just a requirement from the federal government that we maintain the effort of funding that we've had in the prior year. So, so if they were to cut the funding, we can't say, oh, look, we don't have the funding, so we're going to lower what we've been paying. So it kind of sets a floor, is my understanding. I don't have the exact language in front of me.
That's fine. And again, to the folks who are posing these questions, obviously we're not going to be able to do justice to all of them in the next 8 minutes, but if you're registered with your email address, we'll send you answers, and we will also send you a link to this discussion, which is being recorded and featured, I think, on our YouTube channel. A question for any of you who can answer: what impact will a funding deficit have on children or adults on waiver programs, CHRP or DD, funded by Medicaid, and for an adult on a DD waiver, what's the impact of a work requirement?
I'm just going to say one word: huge. Because waivers are not mandated by the law, they're waivers. And so the first thing that's going to get cut is waivers. If you are less money, you've got to do what's required in the law. And then if you got extra, you do things like waivers. So those are the first things, in my opinion, they're going to go.
You have 2 words on that, Bethany? Yeah.
Well, I'm wondering, considering that Olmstead and the Americans with Disabilities Act are still law, that if you cut waiver programs and people end up in institutions or can't get out of institutions and back into the community because you don't have waivers, that does put the state at risk of litigation, all states.
Speaking of litigation, Kathy, what is the likelihood of Texas versus Becerra being successful as written, requesting that Section 504 be declared unconstitutional? You might explain 504 if you could in lay terms. And if that is successful, what does that mean for Colorado?
So Section 504 comes to us federally through the Rehabilitation Act. I think it was 1974. I might have the year wrong. So it's a federal protection that gives broad protection to citizens and people with disabilities. And during the Biden administration, he added in gender dysphoria as a covered piece for 504. And so I think it's 17 states have come together to sue, saying that 504 is unconstitutional. And it would be easy to just solve the problem, if not easy, because we're dealing with gender issues. But if they were to take that language out, but I've looked at the complaint and it's much broader than that. So I think if we were to lose 504, it doesn't just impact students in K-12, it impacts students at higher ed. For example, I have a daughter who's a diabetic and she uses 504 protections to be able to have long enough to take her test in case she needs to take her insulin or take some sugar. So I think losing 504 could be devastating. And I was hoping that it was more narrowly tailored, the lawsuit, but the way I've read it, it's much broader. Sorry, I hate ending on a bad note, but that's how I see it. Others who have read it might see it differently.
What's the impact of the dissolution of the Department of Education on state-funded GED programs and accessibility support for students with disabilities in Colorado?
Can you say that again, Andrew? So
if the U.S. Department of Education is dissolved, what's the impact on state-funded GED programs and on accessibility support for students with disabilities in Colorado? Which you touched on the second point earlier.
Right. I don't see those two as necessarily related because so much of the funding comes from the state. And what I would do is rely on what we just talked about, which is how Colorado is uniquely unable to meet those kinds of increased funding requirements because of Tabor. And so I think it could have a significant impact on those programs. I think right now everything is on the chopping block at the JVC, including those programs.
I'm going to ask the panel and the audience for permission to go like 5 minutes over, depending on your collective schedules. I know folks may peel off just because we're getting so much interest and attention to this. And I do want to make sure the request of our organizer that we leave on a glimmer of hope. We'll settle for a glimmer. How can we advocate? This is a question, a jump ball. How can we advocate against cuts toward HUD programs, such as housing vouchers for people with disabilities?
Call your member of Congress, email your member of Congress, meet with your members of Congress. If there are housing advocacy groups in your area who are doing housing actions, attend those. If you use a Section 8 voucher, make sure that you share your story. I think a lot of people think that they've never met someone who uses a Section 8 voucher, when in reality, we know they are common and in fairly high use, right? And so sharing your story is really, important.
Eric, I know you actually don't have an extra 5 minutes today because you've got to go to the Hill or nearby. So can you give us something hopeful in the last 2 minutes you have to share? 120 seconds of hope, please.
So I would agree with Hillary. I mean, this is something that I have said I worked on before it was more letters. I worked on LGBT rights in Congress. And one of the most important things I said to that group, and I think it's extremely important for the disability group, and Hillary said it, is you need to put a face to these stories, to the individuals, so that they know who it's impacting. If they haven't seen you and haven't interacted with you, they're more willing to just ignore what you say. So I think the disability community is great about getting their stories out, being personable, talking to the members, talking to the staff, and that makes a huge difference. And so to answer one of the other questions that came up, numbers matter. Even if it's a form letter, do it. But if you get the opportunity, make sure you put your personal story in at some point in a phone call or one of those forms. But if you just get the form and you've got a minute, Click the form, do it, because numbers count.
Numbers count. And in Colorado, every family has a connection to this cause. I told my team we have 6 million potential supporters in Colorado that might not know it yet. Other words of hope, Bob, Bethany, Kathy?
Yeah, so I think you just made a great point, Andrew. Everyone I know in Colorado has a connection to someone with a disability. It could be a close family member, and this is liberals, conservatives, Republicans, Democrats, unaffiliated people who were fed up with government, people who voted for Donald Trump, people who voted against Donald Trump. But we're going to see some more chaos. But what's going to become clear in that chaos is there are an awful lot of things on which we depend, which we need, which we agree upon. And my hope is that we will get focused on those things as we go through this. I hesitate to call it a process, but through this ordeal of looking at government. The fact is that there have been things that Elon Musk can point to and say this is a terrible thing. That overlooks a great number of programs that we're all dependent upon and expect.
I appreciate that.
To jump into and say, also talk to your neighbors and talk to people that you run into at school or at the grocery store, because we're also in a lot of islands that are not well connected to each other, partly because of media and other and housing stratification, lots of reasons. But we need to share our thoughts and our knowledge with people around us and bring more people on board to make those calls and send the letters and understand what we're facing.
Kathy, you took me years ago on a tour of rural schools in Colorado, which produced the single largest investment in school construction in state history. So I'm giving you the last word if you'd like to take it, only if you promise to answer in an uplifting manner.
Andrew, that resulted in one of the best things that's ever happened in Colorado because it was bipartisan. And it really has amounted to lifting up thousands of students and families in their environment because those schools were the center of their community. So I will use that opportunity to just say, if we can continue, as we've said here, to work across all party lines, to work across all divisions that we see, because this is the right cause, is to make sure that people understand the impact on the disability community. As you said, we are all impacted, but I remain hopeful that if we pull together, that we will be able to rise up and make sure that people understand these impacts are not okay and that they need to continue not only to just fund as they are, but to increase the supports that are necessary for those members of our community.
I really appreciate that note. So I want to say to you, Kathy, to Bob, to Hillary, to Bethany, and to Eric, thank you. I also want to say thanks to the audience, and I'll offer just a word of apology. I know you all asked many more questions than we could cover in an hour. We captured your questions. We're going to try to answer them. Some of you, again, asked questions about your own experience with discrimination, abuse, and neglect. That's what Disability Walk Colorado is in business to address. So please feel free to respond to the email we send you after this event, or to go to our website at disabilitywalkco.org. I'm grateful to the organizations that sponsored this event I mentioned earlier. And I want to say a special word of thanks as we look at what's next to the fellow who put this event together, Bob Mook, who is our development manager at Disability Walk Colorado. If you want to engage with him, his email is bmook@disabilitywalkco.org. And if you want to make Bob especially happy, and I will tell you, this is the only special effect in the entire presentation, so don't miss it, you can contribute at our QR code or at disabilitywalkco.org. I'll repeat the effect for those of you who appreciate PowerPoint. So just point your camera at our QR code, chip in to our cause, help us continue the fight for disability justice in Colorado and across the country. And thank you all very much. I'm reminded that the organizations represented today are not necessarily espousing all the views that were shared with us. So people are speaking in their individual capacity for the most part. But I think I can speak for all of us when I say we share the goal of making Colorado the best state in the union for people with disabilities to live and work and thrive. And I happen to believe we can get from here to there.